before I forget. So now we're recording. The slides are up, and the last thing we touched upon was the creating of the Constitution with 3 branches of government. It was a result of the compromise, the Great Compromise, sometimes called the Connecticut Compromise, because Roger Sherman was from Connecticut and he proposed it. The compromise that took the legislative idea from the Virginia plan, where there was 2 houses, and it also took the judicial plan of the Virginia plan, and it had an executive more along the lines of the New Jersey plan. Even though there was one president, there would be people around him known as the cabinet that would help the executive be more of a plural branch. There's not just one power divested in one individual. Even though that's the way we pretty much see it today, the president is always front and center. He's got his advisors, his cabinet, and so he's not really going solo. Very quickly, a little comparison between the Articles and the Constitution. The Articles basically put together a confederation or a league of friendship. The Constitution was a more perfect union in which the nation and the states shared power. In the Articles, the states pretty much had all the power. Representation of states was exactly equal under the Articles. Every state had 1 vote. Under the Constitution, with the bicameral legislation, you had both equal and proportional. Larger states getting more representatives than the smaller states, but each state getting 2 senators. Taxation, only the states could tax under the Articles. Now both the federal and state can tax. And then you can see the other differences there. Any questions before we move on to the content on pages 46 and 47? All righty then, let's pull up our next slides. And before we look at this content, I want to talk a little bit about the 3/5 Compromise. The Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, was about the structure of the federal government. The 3/5 Compromise deals with the representation that each state is going to get, and even more specifically, the southern states versus the northern states. So now, let me go back to where I can see you. What year is all of this what are the years that all of this is happening in? Constitutional Convention, drafting of the Constitution. What year are we talking about? Anybody? Anybody?
Like 1773.
Too far ahead, too early, because the Declaration wasn't written until 1776.
It's like 1762.
No, you're going the wrong way. The Constitution came after the Declaration.
1786.
Close, 1787.
1787.
That's not fair. That's cheating. He cheated.
Go to constitutionday.com and learn about the Constitution. Okay, 1787 is when the Constitutional Convention was convened. So this is the point I'm getting at. If I'm talking about northern states versus southern states, usually we think of the Civil War. When was the Civil War? Now I'm really throwing a curveball at you. So before you can Google it, 1860.
That's what I was going to say.
Oh, okay, very good. 1860 is the Civil War, which is North versus South, right? So how are we already talking about North versus South in 1787? Because from the time that we had the founding of Jamestown, Virginia in 1609, from 1609 to 1787, we had the original 13 colonies all eventually formed. And then there was a regional division between North and South based on the types of economy. In the North, you had merchants and you had small farmers, you had fishermen. In the South, you had the big plantation owners, and they were the ones that were the main importers of slaves. Excuse me. So by the time you get to 1787, there is already an unofficial division between the northern states. And by the way, most of the northern states, or well, all of the northern states opposed slavery. There was no slavery in the northern states. Slavery was only existing in the southern states by the time the Constitution was written. There were many in the North who wanted to do away with slavery. The slave trade had already been abolished in England, and so that sentiment had reached the United States, especially in the North. Now, I'm going somewhere with this concerning the Three-Fifths Compromise. When it came time to deciding how many representatives each state got, right? And this was the chamber called the House of Representatives. Every state would get so many representatives based on their population. And here's what the deal was. The South wanted to count their slaves as citizens so they would get more representatives who would then represent them in Congress. And if the South were able to count their slaves fully, they would have a slight majority in the House of Representatives. The northern states did not want to count the slaves in their population because they weren't citizens, they didn't have rights. But the South was opposed to that because that would give the northern states a 2/3 majority in the House of Representatives. Now, there was also an issue about taxes, as you can see here. And it had to do with the economy in the South, how it would be hurt. So the Three-Fifths Compromise listen to me very closely. The Three-Fifths Compromise was not a racial thing. It was not a whites versus black thing. It was a slave versus free thing. And you could be white and a slave back then, all right? So hear me out. The Three-Fifths Compromise was not about racism, but it was about the issue of slavery and freemen. And so they came up with the Three-Fifths Compromise, which meant that the slaves would be counted, not considered 3/5 of a person, but if you had 100 slaves, only 60 of them would be counted in your population. All right? 3/5 of the slaves would be counted towards a state's overall population. And what this did was this then made it to where the southern states had the same amount of representatives as the northern states. Here's another thing you need to hear that you're not going to hear today from the news or the media. But this was to eventually help get rid of slavery. Now, let's go face to face. You might be thinking, how can allowing slavery to still exist eventually lead to getting rid of slavery? Well, think of the word compromise. What does a compromise mean? Anybody? If you make a compromise with somebody, what are you doing? Let's say if you and your boyfriend or girlfriend, whoever it may be, want to go out on a date, but, oh, here we go.
Negotiating,
right? Negotiating so that things don't break down and there's a separation. But you're negotiating so that you can move forward. You have to make some concessions in order for the partnership to work. So the North really wanted a new constitution. The South did too, but the South didn't want to give up their prerogative to have the South didn't want to feel like they were getting the brunt of taxation. So if they did not do this Three-Fifths Compromise, the South would not have come into the Union. They would have refused. They would have said, you're going to tax us. You're going to tax our agricultural exports of tobacco and cotton. And then you're going to also, because all the merchants are primarily in the North, you're going to tax all the imports from other nations coming in, which we rely on, and you're going to hit us hard with taxes. And then there's a lot of talk in the North about getting rid of the slave trade. So in order for there to be a national government, the North had to compromise. Okay, we'll count 3/5 of your slaves towards your representatives, and that'll make it equal. And we will also do this. Here's another thing that I don't know if you read about, but the North could not ban slavery for 20 years. In other words, they couldn't ban it until 1808. So this compromise was put into place so that there would be a union, a more perfect union, but eventually there were steps there that would lead to the abolition of slavery. Now, as we got closer to that in 1860, the South eventually did, right? the South eventually did secede from the Union, and we entered into a 4-year civil war. And it's a shame because I believe around 60,000 Americans lost their lives, but it was to abolish slavery. But I want you to see that the seeds and the roots to the Civil War were already planted and growing during the time of the Constitution. And the Three-Fifths Compromise was a solution to help lead to the abolition of slavery. So any questions on that? Because you'll hear some people say, oh, all of the founding fathers were slave owners and they wanted to hold on to their right to keep slaves. So they kept slavery in the Constitution with the Three-Fifths Compromise. No, that's not why they did it. It was so that the South would not have more people and they would be able to keep slavery in their culture permanently. This ultimately will lead to the ending of slavery in America. All righty, any questions before now that we're going to move to pages 45 and 46 material. And we're going to get to learn about one of those other good-looking French philosophers from the 1700s. They're more of a, you can see they're more of a, I want to think of the right word here. They're more of a delicate good-looking, whereas me, I'm a more rugged good-looking type of guy. So I just wanted you to see the difference there. And I say that with all humility. Okay? So we're going to learn about Montesquieu for a little bit. He is mentioned on page 47, excuse me. He is mentioned on page 47, and he is mentioned in National Treasure 2, if you want to consult that excellent movie. But he was a French political philosopher. And just as that dashing, good-looking guy, John Locke, was influential upon our Declaration of Independence, Montesquieu was very influential upon our Constitution. And his writings about politics were based on an ancient Greek guy named Polybius. Or I should say Rome, not Greek, because ancient Rome was a democracy at one time. And so Montesquieu studied Polybius, and Polybius advocated for a separation of powers. See that phrase right there? Separation of powers. Which would be then the separation of powers would be encoded in a constitution. So Montesquieu was an admirer of Polybius, and this is the source of our Constitution, which lays out a separation of powers. All right, so know who Montesquieu is. Now, the good news is you don't have to know all of this name and title. Just know Montesquieu. Are you with me? All right. So there are several different elements mentioned in your textbook that I want to make sure you know for the test. Several of these elements, well, all of these elements are what make up our Constitution, by which our government is governed today. The first thing is bicameralism. And we've touched on this, so I won't touch on it very long, but this was basically bi means two, cameralism, houses or chambers. So our Congress, our legislative branch is separated into two separate houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. This was one way to diffuse the power of Congress. Remember, under the Articles, Congress really was the only branch, except they could appoint a president or they could appoint judges, but Congress had all the power. This way, under our new Constitution, Congress will not become the most powerful branch. Then there's a concept in our Constitution called checks and balances. So you'll see here are three branches: executive, legislative, judicial. The concept of checks and balances means that the executive branch, for example, will help to keep balance between these two branches, but will also keep a check on them. So, for example, let's say the Congress passes a law. The executive branch, under the leadership of the president, they can veto that law. They can say nope, or the president can say nope, that law is not good enough, go back to the starting point and try again. Now, let's say the people of Congress feel like that's a good law and the president is trying to exercise too much power. Congress can override a president's veto. And they can say, nope, you're not going to have a say in this. We're going to override your veto, and this is going to be a law. But then, to make sure that Congress doesn't have too much power, the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, has the power to review all laws. This is called judicial review. And if they feel like a law is not constitutional, they can strike it down. So checks and balances is a form, is a method of making sure that these three branches keep each other accountable and one of them doesn't become more powerful than the others and abuse their power. Questions? You might be thinking, who checks Instructor Bings in our class that he won't become an abusive, dictatorial professor or instructor? And there are checks and balances to me. But you guys know that, right? You're not worried. You can already see that I'm a good and beneficial leader. All right, federalism. Federalism is another concept. You guys, several of you have already done your chapter 4 brief about federalism, or chapter 3 brief, excuse me. And so you've understood that federalism is a governmental system in which the powers of government are both shared and divided by one central federal government. And then at that time, it was the 13 smaller state governments. Today, 50 state governments. And this is where all those powers and clauses came in that you wrote about. The implied powers, the shared powers, the explicit powers, the supremacy clause, all those things. Because even though the powers are divided and shared, you still have to have some kind of system where, all right, who is the supreme law? Well, our Constitution. The supremacy clause. Our Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So that's our stopping point for today. Any questions?
I have a question. On Blackboard, where it has chapters 1 through 4 outline due, you have 2 due dates. And I was wondering why.
Because Instructor Bings is a limited, flawed human being. Okay, let me check here. Chapters outline, you say?
Yeah, chapters 1 through 4, you had 2 due dates. One September 2nd, one September 3rd.
Okay. September 3rd is the due date.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for pointing that out. I will get that changed. Any other questions? I know that probably kind of shocks you that I'm not perfect, but you guys, I'm glad you smile and laugh. That makes me feel good. Have a great Wednesday and Thursday, and we'll see you Friday morning